crouching at the window in the living room. I thought of that window, which I'd sat beside over so many years. It stretched from one side of the room to the other, looking out onto the garden. In the garden was the magnolia tree. The flowers were perfectly pink, the petals translucent, lying softly in the grass like shells left behind by the tug of the tide. After the phone call, the neighbours managed to get inside. They rang us back half an hour later. They had found my grandmother sitting in her armchair, head slumped, the dog nuzzling her feet. She had died. We drove to her house. Richmond Park was dark. A solitary bicycle light strobed across the grass, catching the retina of a stag, motionless, an unwavering silhouette in the glare. At the house, Mum asked whether I wanted to see Granny, or would it upset me too much. I told her I wanted to see her, and say goodbye. The police were already there. I stood with them in the small kitchen my grandfather had built, whilst my mum went in to see her mother. I stared at the rust on the taps. Mum cried, an after-dark animal sound, clipped short, breath sucked in. It reverberated in the air. I couldn't see her, but I imagined her holding on to my grandmother, her head and hands in her mother's lap. It was the first time I had heard somebody mourn. I kept as still as I could, gripping the edge of the kitchen sink, staring at the rust. My sister was away, studying midwifery in Stoke-on-Trent. When she came home for the first time, she told me something she had learned during her lectures on genetics, that women are born with all the eggs they are ever going to have. Thus, in some sense, as far back as the day my grandmother was born, she had carried the beginnings of us inside her. When I went to see Granny in the living room, I found her the same and yet changed. Everything I knew as my grandmother was still there. The gold Star of David round her neck, her calf-length pleated skirt, the faint smell of chicken stock and talcum powder, her beautiful silver hair cut into a bob that curled beneath her chin so that she looked like a girl again. She was the same, but her skin was wax-like and cool, and her chest no longer rose and fell with breath. I held her hand and said goodbye. 5 years later, in the summer of 2012, I saw my second dead body when I performed last offices for a patient. She had died on my first placement as a student nurse. It was my first ward, my first morning, my first hour of nurse training. The nursing sister asked me whether I felt comfortable about doing it. I didn't know what to expect. Certainly didn't want to say no to anything during my first placement. So Linda, the healthcare assistant, collected what we needed from the store cupboard, and we went into the side room, shutting the door behind us. Linda was in her 50s, had been working in hospitals for over 30 years. She was nearly 6 foot tall, broad but gentle and kind. When I'd arrived that morning, I'd asked her if she was the matron. She'd smiled and showed me where the staff room was, and when we sat down to receive the handover, learning about the patients on the ward, she'd nodded at me from across the room, sitting there in the grey stripes of the healthcare assistant uniform. Healthcare assistants carry out numerous tasks in the hospital, ranging from bed-making to helping to feed, wash and dress patients. They can also gain extra qualifications in blood-taking and applying wound dressings. Their presence on the ward is fundamental to a smooth-running shift. Linda and I barely spoke as we stood on either side of the elderly patient. It is the only time I have washed and shrouded someone without knowing anything about them, without even knowing their name. The woman was still warm. I wanted to check her pulse, but didn't. I didn't know how she had died. All her rings were wedged beneath the gnarled knots of her knuckles, and I wondered how long she'd worn them for. We rolled her and washed her back. She moved easily, having died only an half-hour before, and been left to rest there in the quiet half-light of the room. Linda took out the shroud from its plastic. It was paper-thin and ruffled at the neck. We took time working out how the woman's arms would be best placed.